I'm going to talk about the brain. I'm going to talk about, my topic is the fact that the brain goes through a maturation period. It takes about 25 years for the brain to fully develop. The developmental process that I'm going to explain in a moment, it actually will help you explain and understand your teenager. And it'll help you understand the development that they go through and why certain things that seem illogical and unreasonable to you are actually occurring in their brain. As a result of this brain development, which as I say takes 25 years, I'm going to say that 24, 25 years a number of times through this presentation, teens engaged in high excitement, high risk, high energy behavior. And that includes experimenting with drugs and alcohol. Early use of drug and alcohol has really significant negative effects. Not just addiction, which I'll get into in a moment, but negative effects of almost any use. And so that's one point to drive home. And the other point is we can do something about it. Okay? As Dr. Allen said, prevention is really the key. And that's why it's so great to be in a middle school, and we really need to soon be in the elementary schools to be talking about some of this. So we know more about brain development now than we ever did because of newer ways to measure and to peer inside the brain. As I said, we used to think that the brain was pretty fully developed by about 10, and then all that happened after that was just experience that people went through. But as I said, we now know that it takes about 25 years for the brain to mature, for the brain to develop, and interestingly, we're actually born with more neurons. We actually lose neuronal connection as the years go by. Not exactly our brains shrink, but you know, the way the brain works is neurons talk to each other through chemistry, and as certain patterns get used and strengthened, the ties get stronger, and other ones that don't get used fall apart or fall away. And so we actually have less neuronal connections later in life than we did when we first were born. The brain is an organ under construction, and as I said, adolescence is a period of profound brain maturation, and as I said, it was believed it was complete during childhood, but it actually takes 25 years. This is a this is a slide of the brain from 5 years old to 20 years old, and the blue represents maturing of brain neurons. So the brain actually develops from the back of the head to the front of the head. And why that's important is certain parts of the brain develop before other parts. And when the brain is such that certain parts have certain functions. And so certain functions in our lives are developed before other functions are developed. First part of the brain is the cerebellum. I don't know if you could read the writing on there, but the cerebellum is the back of the brain. It's the first to develop, and it's important for physical activity. Kids begin to learn what their bodies are like. They begin to feel their bodies in the world, feel their bodies in space. They start, getting a sense of their physical abilities and so on. Coordination starts developing, and they have interest in recreational activities. Teens with this, as they go through this stage, they prefer a lot of physical activity, a lot of, just as I say, feeling themselves out in the world. Next we have the nucleus accumbens, a little further down in the brain, and this is where the motivation begins to develop, the desires to do things, and they start having interest in things. They prefer high excitement, low effort activities, like video games. Somebody with a developed nucleus accumbens is the kid staring for 20 hours, at the video, and you can't get them away from it. Next is the amygdala, and the amygdala is the seat of emotions. It's our emotional area. So now we have physical motivation and this feeling emotional state. This kids are starting to get in their teenage years feelings that they never had, and they start seeing themselves in society, and they start seeing themselves in relationship to other people, and they get worried and nervous and anxious, and all kinds of feelings begin to develop for them. It's actually a highly sensitive time when this amygdala develops. So we've got three things developed. What do you notice is missing? What? Logic. Okay. The last to develop, unfortunately, or not unfortunately, but just developmentally, is the prefrontal cortex, which is the reasoning executive functioning, logic, and it helps control our behavior. It's kind of our red light system. Without that, the red light system, I call it the red light system, means you go through the world and you have desires and feelings and you want to do something, then you say, well, wait a second, maybe I shouldn't do that particular behavior because these are the consequences and I may not want to get into it, so I'm going to stop doing that. Kids don't have their red light system fully developed yet, number one. As we'll learn later, one of the effects of using a lot of drugs and alcohol is you ruin that red light system and you begin to forget about natural consequences and making good choices. It's not until, as I say, the age of 24, 25, that prefrontal cortex is developed. So you've got these high-risk, risk-taking, high-energy, physical, hormones, pouring through them, kids who don't have their prefrontal cortex connected yet. And so they're going to make some bad choices. They don't think about safety, they don't think about consequences. It's a very vulnerable period in their life. And it's also a time they're more likely to experiment with drugs and alcohol. And it's a time where drugs and alcohol can really sort of hijack their brains. Interestingly, the car companies have it right. You can go to war, you can drink in a bar, you can do all these things, but it's not until 25 that people will rent you a car. And so I don't know if they did it by design or not, but they actually are the ones who have, at least neurologically, developmentally, the correct responses. Because you don't want to give a 6,000-pound, 200 horsepower vehicle to somebody whose prefrontal cortex isn't connected yet. So we're learning early exposure in this developing brain of so it's bad enough, it's hard enough to be a teenager. Then you start sprinkling some drugs or alcohol in that mix. And now you're going to have a real problem on a number of levels. First of all, the mentality and the decision-making is really going to get impaired. Latest research indicates that just small amounts of alcohol, small amounts of marijuana actually have very serious negative impact on learning and on memory. And on memory and retention. And it may not seem like a lot, but when you do the studies, it really sometimes is the difference between a grade or 2 grades on an exam. And that's just somebody who might have used the day before at a party. Now here's again, as I said, I'm really happy there's a middle school, young parents of younger kids. Prevention is really the key, because I'm going to tell you something. Howard talked about his experiences. The majority, and Greg talked about, the percent of kids who are experimenting and using, the majority of kids who use are not going to become addicts, okay? Let's just pick a round figure. 10% will have a dependency or addiction or serious problem, but 90% of kids will not become addicted. So on some level, the problem is a little different for those 90%. And the problem for the 90% is really the negative consequences that they're going to potentially put themselves through as they go through this experimental period. And what are those negative consequences? We have people who are, their grades are going to suffer, their self-esteem is going to suffer, they're going to have health issues, sometimes there'll be tickets or arrests, as the officer Garcia will talk about later. Their college admissions will suffer potentially if they've had an arrest on their record. They may not get financial aid. They may have trouble getting a FAFSA, loans and so on, because they ask these kinds of questions. Accidents occur, injuries to themselves, injuries to others, sexual acting out, pregnancy, sexual transmitted disease, and hurting reputations. I've worked with one school, I shouldn't even say this, but some kids in their behavior, and again, they're not addicted, they're just using, they're sort of bragging oftentimes about the behavior that they're in. We worked in one school where a group of girls called themselves, and excuse the language, I'm just going to, the effable 5. It was more than 5, and this was public. And then it spread to become an effable many, and it was all drug and sexual acting out related. And ultimately, the worst negative consequence, of course, is death, which happens, and happens unfortunately way too frequently. So as I said, the real key in our work is prevention of not just of becoming addicted, but prevention of use of any kind as much as possible and as long as possible. So every year, for example, that we can delay the use of a substance, every year we can help a child stop using, it's going to have a significant effect in reducing their developing a dependency disorder. This is just an example. The percentage of past year alcoholism dependency or abuse among adults aged 21 or older based on the age of first use. So if you use before you're 12 years old, you have about a 16% chance of developing an alcohol dependency. If you wait till you're 12 or 14, it goes down to 15. If you wait till 15 to 17, it goes down to 9%, so on down the line. And if you wait till you're 21 years or older, when the brain is actually a little more developed, you have less than a 3% chance of developing dependency. So delaying that onset by any degree is really, really important. So anything we can do is essential. Just some words about, as I mentioned, negative consequences. Over the last 20 years, life expectancy has increased for all ages except 15 to 24. The three leading causes of death are accidents, suicide, and homicide, all linked to drug and alcohol use. The leading cause of death of 16 to 24 is driving while impaired. Although 16 to 24 are only 70% of the population, they're involved in 48% of the fatal accidents. And oftentimes their fatalities are others. And every day, 14 kids, 15 and 19 die, and 360 are injured in alcohol-related traffic accidents. I'm going to run through the next ones real quick because, in addition, as I said, what I've tried to put forward to you is that brain development leads to high risk, high energy, and poor judgment behavior by teens. What we really want to do, as our last slide, is keep them alive till they're 25. That's our goal. So thank you for having me.